Right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here this morning. I am thrilled and excited to introduce this semester's Beto Chair speaker, Dr. Amy Farrell. Dr. Farrell is the director of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Northeastern University, where she is also the co-director of the Violence and Justice Research Lab. For over a decade, Dr. Farrell's research has examined how the criminal justice system administers justice. She has focused much of her scholarly attention on understanding how the criminal justice system responds to the newly prioritized crimes such as human trafficking. As we know, human trafficking was criminalized by the federal government in 2000, and since that time, 50 states have passed laws outlawing human trafficking, some most recently as 2013. Dr. Farrell has studied and published research about how local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies identify, investigate, and prosecute human trafficking cases. As part of this body of work, Dr. Farrell has sought to understand how the public views the problem of human trafficking and what responses they expect from state and federal governments. She has testified about police identification of human trafficking before the U.S. House of Representatives Judiciary Committee. She was also appointed to the Massachusetts Attorney General's Human Trafficking Policy Task Force and currently serves on the Governor's Working Group on Human Trafficking in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In addition to studying criminal justice responses to human trafficking victimization, Dr. Farrell has examined how variable levels of racial group and gender representation among courtroom work groups relate differences in charging, adjudication, and sentencing. Today, Dr. Farrell's talk is titled Exploitive Work and the Trafficking of Children for the Purpose of Labor in the U.S. Welcome, Dr. Farrell.
Thank you, Studi. Thanks very much for having me here. I want to take just a moment to let you know that this is a great honor to be here, surrounded by this big picture of Sam Houston. But for a number of reasons, many of you know Professor Cocolera was a student of mine, and it's, I think, one of the greatest honors that you can have as a professor to have a fantastic doctoral student win awards, become a great professor, and then invite you to come give a talk at an institution for which they're the Beto Chair. This is your first year in that role. So I was just really thrilled on a lot of levels, and I want to thank Dean Lyons and Professor Ingram and all of the faculty and students that I've met with so far for extending such a wonderful, warm welcome to me and inviting me here to Houston. And to my good friend Sean Gabadon, who was a surprise in the audience that I didn't know was here. So I'm really happy to be giving this talk today. So let me start by giving a little bit of background on sort of what brought me to this topic. As Studi mentioned, I am the director of the School of Criminology. I'm an administration of justice scholar. I'm really interested in how the justice system responds to and sometimes is tasked with responding to social problems that we have labeled as crimes, whether or not them being labeled as crimes is necessarily the best way to solve those problems. And I think child labor trafficking is one of those really complicated issues that needs perspective beyond just the criminal justice system. So I'll be talking today about a study that I just recently completed with my colleagues at NYU and Loyola Law School that was funded by the National Institute of Justice, and it sort of fits into a broader work that I'm doing to understand the challenges of responding to really complex social problems like trafficking, which include sex trafficking, labor trafficking, adults, children, U.S. citizens, foreign nationals, and for which there's not an easy solution because it's embedded, the exploitation of individuals is embedded in so many of our systems, our economic systems, our employment systems, our immigration systems, social welfare systems, their human rights problems. So, the idea that we can criminalize something and that will solve the problem is, a really simplistic notion. But there is a role of the criminal justice system, and we'll be talking a little bit about that today. So I want to sort of set up the framework for sort of how I approach this problem. So as I mentioned, I'm an administration of justice scholar, which for those of you who are students, the way we think about that is criminology is our explanation for why people commit crime, and administration of justice or justice process scholarship is understanding why the system does what it does. and that generally it is not a logical response to crime. The outcomes of the justice system can be explained by multitudes of other theories and theoretical perspectives beyond just that it is a rational response and outcomes to crime. So most of my research is in that administration of justice perspective. Human trafficking is sort of a lens that I've used really over the last 15 to 20 years to try to understand administration of justice questions. And it's been a fascinating area to study because I sort of got to witness and watch and chronicle and empirically test as we sort of came to this crime framing place in the late 1990s around taking a lot of different forms of exploitation and giving them this legal label as human trafficking. We passed federal laws criminalizing behavior associated with human trafficking. We then sort of had to implement responses to those criminal laws in the criminal justice system and train hundreds of thousands of law enforcement officers about what different forms of human trafficking were. We then had to prosecute people and learn how to create evidentiary standards and standards for jurors to understand. Prosecutors had to learn about crimes and understand when to prosecute something as trafficking and when to prosecute something else. We had to think about whether or not any of this criminal justice activity was doing anything to actually prevent trafficking and think about the services to people that needed help and whether or not holding an offender accountable met their needs and solved problems that put them at risk for victimization or others at risk for victimization. So it's been a great lens in which to examine really interesting questions about the way the justice system gets called upon to solve problems, the ways that it does it well and the ways that there are limitations to that approach, and the unintended consequences of the decision to solve a social problem by creating a crime and invoking the criminal justice system as the solution to that social problem, which I think for today's talk, I'm really focused much more on the phenomena itself that we've labeled as a crime, right? And that is, today I'm going to be talking about child labor trafficking, which had a lot of different labels before it became child labor trafficking, and actually is a lot of gray area between civil, worker rights, workplace violations, and criminal labor trafficking. And I'm going to specifically be focusing on the issues that emerged for young people in that situation. So just a little working definition for us all about what child labor trafficking is, right? And many of you may have being in Texas, this is probably not a new issue, that you're very familiar with challenges that have emerged around children working, particularly what's been publicized more recently is migrant children working. The New York Times, Hannah Dreyer, who's one of a really terrific investigative journalist, has done a whole series of pieces over the last year. I had the pleasure to work on background with Hannah on a lot of that work. She's just done a truly remarkable, if you haven't checked it out, there are about 10 different articles that Hannah did for the New York Times focused on child exploitation, mostly focused on migrant children being exploited in the United States. And it really brought a lot of public attention to this problem. And from a social science perspective, one of my fears was that we moved too far, too quickly in policymaking without understanding what the problem was. And so this research really was intended to be exploratory, to set the groundwork of saying, what is this thing that we are labeling as child labor trafficking? Who are victims of child labor trafficking? What is their experiences? And what are the barriers that they face in getting their needs met? So the criminal justice system is a part of this, but not central to the questions that I was looking at in this study. So let me tell you a little bit about the background and the study itself. So just as a framework, so we're all on the same page, some of this may be not new to folks, which is that concern about this thing we called human trafficking really emerged in the 1990s. It had had a lot of different names before that, but if you go back and look at newspaper coverage of the term human trafficking, we really don't see it emerging until about the mid to late 1990s, really taking off after there's some very focused work at the national level around sex trafficking. And as concern about the exploitation of individuals for commercial sex sort of got merged with this question of the exploitation of individuals for work, a variety of different sort of interest groups came together at the federal legislative level and decided to work on passage of this federal law that would criminalize human trafficking. So it kind of smushed together sex trafficking, other forms of exploitation. It was originally under the TVPA framing intended to focus much more heavily on labor trafficking and to focus much more heavily on foreign national migration and the vulnerabilities that individuals faced migrating into the United States and being exploited during that process. Over time, after the passage of the TVPA in 2000 and after states started adopting state anti-human trafficking laws, Texas was one of the first, with Washington in 2003, to adopt state-level anti-trafficking laws. We started to see nationally the sort of co-optation of human trafficking by other interest groups, particularly advocates focused on domestic minor sex trafficking. And we started to see this sort of like what started off much more as a concern about transnational crime and people crossing borders and the vulnerabilities people faced when they crossed those borders, to focus on this problem of the exploitation of children in the United States, mostly focused on U.S. citizen children. And between about 2004 and 2008, we saw a really large shift in the focus nationally to focus on sex trafficking of children. And lost in that process was a lot of the work on labor trafficking. In fact, when we go back and look at federal prosecutions across time, we actually see more federal prosecutions for labor trafficking in the early years of the TVPA than we have seen over time. We've seen this reduction in prosecutions for federal labor trafficking cases, and they were small to begin with. So let me just say, in the 24 years since the passage of the TVPA, really 23 years of implementation, we've had about 50 prosecutions for child labor trafficking cases at the federal level. So a really small number of cases sort of coming to the attention to federal authorities and actually being prosecuted as labor trafficking. They might have been prosecuted as other things, alien harboring, they might have had other types of criminal prosecutions, but being prosecuted as labor trafficking, very small. That doesn't mean that child labor trafficking wasn't happening. That doesn't mean that exploitation of children wasn't occurring. That just means it wasn't being identified and prosecuted as that type of crime. And so we had this sort of dominance of a sex trafficking narrative, which I'm happy in the question and answer to talk about some of the implications of that and some of the ways in which that has resulted in the criminalization of particular types of people for sex trafficking and not others. That's a whole nother narrative that I do a lot of work on. But I'm going to focus here on this issue of labor trafficking and of children. And so at that same time that we saw the co-optation of this protection that was supposed to be existing for people against labor exploitation diminishing because it was being co-opted by sort of the sex trafficking, anti-trafficking wing of the anti-trafficking movement, we started to see this increase in vulnerability actually for individuals who were the original groups intended to be protected by the TVPA, with, I would say, two really important intervening characteristics. There's likely more than these two, but I'm going to pull these two out to talk about that. One is the national housing crisis, which put more and more families and young people in situations of being unhoused or having temporary or precarious housing, and also the migrant crisis, right? So these two sort of phenomena were occurring at the same time. I'm going to pull out the migrant crisis really quickly and tell you something that you already know, which, just for purposes of saying it, is that during this same time period, what we can start to see is the number, this is a graph of the number of unaccompanied minors that came into the United States. And what you can start to see is by, you start to see this rise between 2012 through 2019, a dip down in 2020 for COVID when borders were closed, and then this dramatic rise back up in 2021, right? So we have, since about 2012, there have been more than 750 100,000 unaccompanied minors coming into the United States, right? Those are the identified unaccompanied minors. And I think that's very important to say, right? There's plenty of unidentified accompanied minors. These are the unaccompanied minors that we've identified as unaccompanied minors. They've come into the United States, been apprehended by some type of border service, and been put into ORR custody. And one of the things that we see with this large number of young people coming across the border, and in this case, coming across the border by themselves without family members, right? There's actually a fairly comparable, I think I have the, I didn't put it up here. There's a fairly comparable increase in families coming at the same time, so families with children. But this unaccompanied minors, as you can imagine, kids are particularly vulnerable to exploitation because they're here in the United States, they're by themselves, they generally are needing to find work pretty fast because they don't have a place to live and they don't have money. And they've just made a very long journey to cross the United States, and they owe someone money immediately, right? Their family owes someone money, or they owe someone money who facilitated their journey to the United States. And that amount of money that they can owe ranges, from a few $1,000s, maybe upwards to $10,000, but that debt is accumulating, and their family may also be in a precarious position. One of the things that we find, I think is important to remember, is that once kids get into ORR custody, they can be sponsored out. And that's generally what we try to have happen. And in that period where we saw that big surge, and there was a lot of public concern about young people in detention, we wanted to get those young people out of detention as fast as possible and get them into the community, living with families or living with someone who had sponsored them. And what we find is while the majority of those young people that get apprehended are in Texas and in the southern border states, right, they're going everywhere once they get sponsored out, right? So they're being sponsored to go live with individuals who are friends, acquaintances, family members, sometimes people unknown to the child, and in some interesting cases, traffickers who have posed as sponsors. We have a few fairly high-profile cases and situations where traffickers have actually set up schemes to use the ORR system in order to exploit children for the purposes of work. But, you start to see movement of kids into a lot of different areas that when you look at this map you begin to see these aren't necessarily, the darker spots or the spots that have higher concentrations of unaccompanied minors in them. They're not necessarily urban core, right? They're sometimes, I'm from Kansas, and one of those little dots right there that's dark blue is Garden City, Kansas, which is the home of 3 different meatpacking plants, right? So kids are going to places where they may know somebody who works somewhere, but those people are oftentimes working in precarious industries themselves. Right? So it's not just kids staying in Texas or staying in Florida or New Mexico or Arizona, but actually going out into communities more broadly. Right? And this sets up a position where you have a vulnerability of young people that may be living with families who need them to work, may be living in situations where they started off with a sponsor, but they've actually left that family and are now living on their own with other groups of kids. Because as you can imagine, in sponsorship situations, a child who has this very strong urgency to need to make money because they owe money to someone who facilitated their travel over the border, is living with someone who is making them go to school because that's what is required by ORR. They may, in fact, leave that situation and be living on their own where they can go somewhere and work. We also have situations where either sort of nefariously or oftentimes just because that family that they've been sponsored to is also living on the margins, young people start working and working more and working overnight and not going to school and needing to make money. And so they're living with families where the kids in the family are also working, oftentimes in situations where they are at risk of exploitation themselves. Even with the best intentions of a very loving sponsorship family, but just a family that's on the margins and living in a precarious situation and doesn't have other resources of social support. So when you heard the term child labor trafficking, what do you think of? So let me just start there. Right. If we know nothing about child labor trafficking, you've just heard about it in the news, we'll make this a little interactive. I'm sure that doesn't work for the live stream, but just a few hands. What do you think of when you hear that term child labor trafficking? Yes. Mass media, like Law and Order, for example, when they portray children right? So the first thing you think of when you hear sort of child trafficking is you hear of sex trafficking. You think of sex trafficking, right? So I want to have you sort of leave that from your mind. That is our dominant narrative. And you're going to see some of the child labor trafficking victims that we ended up finding were found only because people thought they were sex trafficking victims, right? So that is the dominant narrative. What else? When you think of actual child labor or exploitive child labor, yes? Okay. Manufacturing, meat packing, dangerous, those kinds of dangerous conditions. What else might you think of? Yeah.
Being like disadvantaged.
Okay, so that we'll come to that. This idea of coercion and being having vulnerabilities. Other industries that we think of. Yeah.
Like major big industries like companies like Sheeny.
Yep, okay, so what we think of, and we might actually there be thinking about children in other countries, right? And we might think about sort of dirty supply chains, but what trafficking happening in countries where children are working in manufacture or working in bricklaying or working in brick kilns or working in farms, right? So we oftentimes think about these situations that, what I find over and over again is stakeholders in a community saying like, oh yeah, well we don't have a lot of farms here, or we don't have a lot of meat packing plants, or we don't have a lot of X, Y, or Z. So we probably don't have child labor trafficking here because we don't have those things that we traditionally think of. What I'm going to show you though is what we found is that children were exploited in all different kinds of industries. Basically, I left this project like you do when you collect data and you deal with really difficult topics, thinking, you know, the world is a terrible place, and also that anytime there is a vulnerable person and a person with a bad motivation, you can get exploitation, right? We saw this in convenience stores, restaurants, animal husbandry, in situations of woodworking, in big manufacturing, in small manufacturing, those mom and pop, pretty much across the board, right? There was not one industry. There are industries that have more vulnerability, but those are largely because they're not regulated. So things like domestic work and things like agriculture, we do see potentially more child labor trafficking in, but that's largely a function of the fact that they're less regulated industries. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and also sort of what we learned about the phenomena. So I've given you a little bit of background, the TVPA, sort of what, we have this existing framework of child labor laws. And let me actually just go to this slide. So we have protections against child labor that exist in our civil labor laws. Right? So children can't work under a certain age, usually 14 in most states, sometimes 16. Children have to only work so many hours in a week. Children can't work after a particular time. So we have the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act, and then states also have labor standards. And the federal laws are the minimum, and many states go beyond the federal laws, and it varies a lot by states. Some states have incredibly poor child labor laws, and other states have much more expansive child labor laws. So there's differences across the United States. Trafficking kind of comes, so you have child labor, and then you have exploitive child labor. So, right, child labor that is violating the Fair Labor Standard Act. That would be a civil exploitive child labor situation. And then you have situations where that labor is compelled by force, fraud, or coercion, and that makes it criminal labor trafficking. And that's an important distinction because when we talk about young people, unlike sex trafficking, where there's a waiver of force, fraud, or coercion if a child is involved in commercial sex, in labor trafficking, there is no waiver of force, fraud, because children work, right? So children can work, and it is not automatically assumed to be child labor trafficking. And what we found in this study is that line between children working, particularly in situations where they're dependent in some way, in a guardianship way, on the person that's their employer, is inherently coercive, right? It almost always becomes a coercive, because it's parenting, right? I mean, as a child of a 13-year-old, there's a lot of coercion in my life, right? Which is like, let's get ready in the morning, there's coercion, right? That is, this line for kids between what is compulsion that meets a standard of coercion at that sort of definition of the federal criminal violation, and what's just generally what I have to do because adults have told me to do it, is a really hard line to see. Yeah? Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so in 2000, the federal government, Congress passed a law called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which established human trafficking as a crime. So it established a number of different things. It established sex trafficking as a crime and labor trafficking as a crime. It created the legal standards for those two crimes. It created a visa, an ability of individuals to stay in the country if they had been a victim of labor trafficking or sex trafficking, sort of like the U visa if you've been a victim of crime. It was called the T visa. It established some funding for services. It was really the watershed legislation that established trafficking as a crime that existed, right? As a phenomena and as a criminal phenomena. The TVPA was passed in 2000, there have actually been reauthorizations of the TVPA about every 2 years that have expanded out the definition. And one of the very important reauthorizations of the TVPA was in 2014 and 2015 in a bill called the Strengthening Families Act and then a bill called the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, both of which clarified that children who are victims of sex trafficking are automatically child abuse victims and should be treated by the state child welfare system as such and should not be criminalized. Those same provisions did not exist under those federal laws for labor trafficking of children. There are 11 states that have integrated labor trafficking into their child abuse statutes. But in most states, labor trafficking of children is not considered a form of child abuse under the child welfare standards of the state. Right? So that's a fairly big distinction between sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Does that help? Okay, get us all on the same page for the TVPA, right? Okay, so there's no waiver of this force, fraud, and coercion. What makes commercial sex or work of any kind trafficking is that it's induced by force, by fraud, or by coercion, right? So if I was a professor somewhere and I was in debt bondage to someone, right? Even all different kinds of jobs. It doesn't have to be an exploitive job at its core, but if that work is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, it becomes labor trafficking. And similarly, we could get into a debate about why sex work and non-sex work were separated out in the law. There's a long history to that, which creates a lot of complications. But sex work is defined separately as commercial sexual exploitation as a violation of sex trafficking in the federal law from other forms of work. And today I'm actually going to be talking a little bit about where some new research is going, which is a new project that we're doing on forced criminality, which actually came out of this study, in which we're finding in the labor trafficking, so the non-sex work part of work, the labor trafficking end, we have actually interestingly found exploitation both in licit economies and in illicit economies. So although illicit economies like drug trafficking or firearms trafficking or shoplifting are not regulated by the Fair Labor Standards Act, they're still sometimes work, right? And so they can still be considered work. So I'll get to talking about that in a minute. All right, so labor trafficking, child labor trafficking is the sort of criminal version of exploitive child work that is moved over that threshold of having force, fraud, and coercion. All right, so I just sort of talked about the fact that it's not considered child abuse everywhere and that we've had very few labor trafficking cases prosecuted, right? So we started this study really to understand the phenomena. It's a little hard to read these questions, so I'll just sort of tell you them really quickly, which is basically, what is child labor trafficking? Where is it occurring? What does it look like when it happens? What are the needs of young people that may have put them in a vulnerability to a situation of child labor trafficking? And what are the barriers for them getting help or for us holding accountable perpetrators of child labor trafficking? So this was an incredibly exploratory study. We weren't trying to test a theory. We weren't trying to evaluate a program. We were really trying to say, what is this thing that we have sort of this law and all of this policy making on that we don't understand very well? And so in order to answer these questions, we had to really think outside the box because there were, because labor trafficking is very hidden. There isn't like a national database of labor trafficking survivors, right? And that would probably be a very biased database if it did exist. And so what we did is we actually worked closely with 4 providers in 4 different states that were known to have worked with child labor trafficking cases. So we're starting this saying, we recognize that we may be missing labor trafficking that is unidentified. But at this first stage of research, we want to know something about the labor trafficking that is identified. So in New York, Ohio, Illinois, and California, we partnered with legal advocacy organizations that worked on getting T visas or worked providing legal advocacy for individuals and had a specific specialized practice around child labor trafficking. And we had, got agreements with them. They basically opened up all their records to us of closed cases. We sampled cases from their closed cases. We then went in and did extensive reviews of their closed cases, did in-depth interviews of each of the legal providers working on each of those cases, and then we're able to do interviews with adult survivors of child labor trafficking who had worked with these legal providers. That was supplemented with an analysis that we did of prosecuted child labor trafficking cases. So about half of our sample were prosecuted child labor trafficking cases where we got basically all of the prosecutorial records associated with those cases and coded those records. And then the other half were these non-prosecuted cases where individuals worked with legal providers to meet various needs that they have, but the cases were not prosecuted by law enforcement. So we are able to kind of identify both those cases that move forward to prosecution and those cases that, for a variety of different reasons, mostly because victims generally didn't see the value of prosecuting these cases for them. They were concerned the cases would actually put them at more risk, and really that wasn't what met their needs. So they got other needs met. Oftentimes legal needs that they had, either about status or about other legal issues that they needed in order to get support. And so we had about 70 cases altogether that we looked at, and then we did these additional interviews that were in-depth interviews with adult survivors of child labor trafficking to really understand this question of what is this phenomena and how does it exist among identified cases. We sampled cases specifically to be across, again, we had these 4 different regions. We were looking for a lot of different kinds of industries. We were looking for variation across gender dynamics. So we have both male, female, trans, and non-gender specific identifying individuals within this sample. And we have a variety of different, we have both US citizen victims and foreign national victims in this sample. So what did we find? We found, again, somewhat surprisingly, to many people that there, in fact, were quite a few U.S. citizen victims. So U.S. citizens that had been identified in a variety of different ways as being victims of child labor trafficking. And that's actually one of the most surprising findings, I think, out of this, which is this is not just foreign national kids, right? There are U.S. citizen kids and there are foreign national kids that are at risk for being victimized. And that shouldn't be surprising to anyone because U.S. citizen kids have economic marginality, they live in racialized societies, they're LGBTQ and have run away from home. They have, they're unhoused, a variety of the same different vulnerabilities that foreign national kids face, U.S. citizen kids face. We found a huge range of industries from domestic servitude through manufacturing to agriculture to forced criminality, right? Pretty much there was no one industry that stood out as being like, this is where they're all located, right? They were across a lot of different industries. The average age was about 14, so there were some kids that were pretty young, that were 11, 12 years old, and some kids that were 17, 18 when they were first trafficked, right? So many of the individuals didn't actually seek legal assistance until they were closer to 18, some of them over 18 when they actually sought legal assistance, but the trafficking started when they were much younger. So this is the average age when they were first trafficked. The lack of safe, affordable housing was a very consistent vulnerability amongst this sample, right? So it was probably the most important characteristic that we saw across. So oftentimes people took jobs with people that they suspected might not be so great because those people offered them place to stay. They offered them housing. They were not on the street anymore. And those same people then exploited them as, exploited them and leveraged that housing as part of the ways that they kept them in an exploitive situation. And it was a barrier for leaving the trafficking situations, because if you left the trafficking situation, you didn't have a home anymore, right? Even if that home was in the basement of a restaurant, or was the back room of a barn, or was somebody's basement where they, fed you crumbs and rotten food, you still had a place to stay. And most kids were trying to figure out a way to get out of that and get into a better situation. Most of the kids realized something was wrong and that they needed to try to get help. Almost universally, young people blamed themselves, that they'd made a mistake, that they'd chosen the wrong person to kind of get connected with, and that they were at fault for what happened to them, and they needed to get themselves out of that situation. And virtually none of them wanted to go to official social services to seek help. One of the things that we found that I'll bring up a little bit more in a minute is the fact that young people were not only afraid of law enforcement, but were equally afraid of child welfare, right? So the thought that they would have to go into the child welfare system oftentimes would prevent them from seeking help. In one of the cases that we're going to look at, the young people, in fact, waited until they turned one day over 18 to call for legal assistance because they didn't want someone to let child welfare know where they were. We found, again, a variety of characteristics of the perpetrators. Most perpetrators were in their 20s and 30s, so they were older, obviously, than the children that were being trafficked. In about a third of the cases, a little under a third, were biological parents, right? So familial-based trafficking, we had a lot of familial-based trafficking. A lot of situations where there were organizations like churches or cults or other organizations that young people were and their families were associated that were involved in the trafficking. About a third were acquaintances that the young person didn't know prior to the trafficking situation, that they sort of became friends with because that person offered them something that they needed, or they were the friend of a friend who offered them something they needed. But while there wasn't one dominant profile of perpetrators, there were these sort of characteristics of people that provided some type of guardianship role to a young person. They were coaches on sports teams, they were leaders of church organizations, they were biological parents, they were people that offered to help and support a young person who needed help and support. So in terms of the actual sort of what is this thing and what does trafficking look like, we found very, very, very high level of exploitation across almost every domain of exploitation. So while coercion was the primary mechanism of exploitation, a large number of these kids eventually experienced force as well, right? So it might not have started off as forced, they weren't kidnapped into this situation, but they were in a situation of extreme coercion, and then eventually at different points when they tried to leave or that they saw someone else being threatened, there was some type of force. And this is actually pretty different than we see with adults, where largely physical force is less predominant. Again, the relationship and the dynamics of that relationship were really the thing that kept them in situations, the true dependence on an adult. The adult provided their communication, they provided their food, they provided their love, they provided all the things that adults provide to children. And those were the things that really kept them in that situation. We interestingly found these cases that popped up across all four of the sites around forced criminality, which really did, pique our interest, and we are now looking much further into it. So these were situations, and I'm going to give an example of a forced criminality case that maybe started off as relationships, sometimes around commercial sex and sometimes completely not, that moved into other types of illicit behavior that was forced or coerced. So let me give you a couple of really quick case examples, because I think it really brings to light what these look like. And then I'll talk about some recommendations. So in this case, this is a licit economy case. So these young people were working in a hotel water park. So in this situation, You had a young person who was from Guatemala. She was a female. She came here to live with a family member. Her family took out a huge amount of debt to get her here. She was from an indigenous background in Guatemala, so she had a lot of vulnerabilities in Guatemala in addition to the vulnerabilities of being from Guatemala in terms of the economic situation. So her family had a lot of just sort of vulnerabilities at home additionally. But she had an adult brother that had made it to the United States, and she came to live with that adult brother. That adult brother was her first trafficker. That adult brother originally forced her to work in a restaurant where he took all of the money that she earned as payment for staying in the restaurant. She worked under the table in the restaurant. The owner of the restaurant was like, I trust the brother. I don't really know this person, but you can work in my restaurant. And no one knew that she was, in fact, unable to get away from her brother. Her brother eventually was the person that had sort of HHS custody of her, and he got eventually deported. And so then she was all by herself, right? She was in the middle of the United States. She did not speak English. She did not speak a language for which someone could do an easy translation because she was of an indigenous background in Guatemala. But she had been housed in when she got apprehended crossing the border, she got housed in a place where she met someone else who was living in she had like their WhatsApp, and so she had connected with that person who'd also been housed in the detention center with her that was in the same community. And they were from the community back in Guatemala. So she connected up with that guy. They found work. He knew of a hotel that had a water park associated with it where they could live in the hotel. The owner of the hotel had a whole floor, or part of a floor, where all the workers lived. They were all Guatemalan. They all worked at this water park, and none of them were being paid. They were basically just being given a place to live and given the ability to eat at the restaurant. And they had to work incredibly long hours at this water park, all of the classic signs of exploitation, right? They knew it was a bad situation. They were trying to get out of the water park, but they stayed in this situation until they were 18, even though they'd been connected with a legal service provider who could help them get a TV visa and help them get out of the water park situation. But they waited till they were 18. This was the case where they just did not want to let DSF know where they were because they were afraid of what that would mean for them and their lack of independence. They eventually left the hotel, and within a few, they started working with this legal provider. The legal provider started working with law enforcement, and within weeks, that whole hotel was shut down, and the owners of the not by law enforcement, they just closed the doors. They knew that a few of the workers had come to this legal aid, and they sort of recognized what was going to, it was like the place just abandoned ship, right? They closed their doors. They weren't there anymore. They moved operations. Nobody was ever apprehended by law enforcement. Nobody paid any back wages. They were just gone. They were in the wind. And these young people were sort of stuck there with all of this trauma and all of this debt and all of this, situation where they needed to have services. Another example is a U.S. citizen illicit economy example. So this is a situation where a 12-year-old girl, again in the Midwest, her mother is being commercially sexually exploited by a man who has a lot of different criminal operations. He has a commercial sex operation, he has a drug distribution operation, and so the mom moves the daughter into this house. She's living with a number of other women, and this man is commercially sexually exploiting them. And they're also fairly drug dependent. The young girl is actually, super entrepreneurial, very tough, and he recognizes pretty early on that he's not gonna commercially sexually exploit her. He's going to start a relationship with her where he actually recruits her to distribute drugs. So she starts working for his drug distribution operation, and then she starts working as the enforcer of rules in this house where her mother is being commercially sexually exploited. She starts physically assaulting women. She starts being part of this sex trafficking operation, basically. So she's not only working with him on the illicit drug operation, but she's also working in the sex trafficking operation, not as a victim, but as an enforcer. She's like 13 years old or 14 years old when she becomes this enforcer in this drug trafficking operation, but she's a very physically dominating young person. And she's being coerced by this guy who she thinks loves her, right? She's a 13 or 14-year-old. And he's providing her housing and food and love and giving her all of this responsibility. And eventually, she's able to get herself free of him when she turns about 16 or 17, gets into social services. But everybody recognizes the sex trafficking piece of this. It took a long time to unpack that she was, although she was part of this operation, right, this criminal operation, she originally was arrested, right, because people thought she was a sex trafficker at 14 years old. And she was originally charged with crimes. So they had to work on figuring out, like, would she be actually charged with sex trafficking crimes, even though she was actually, you know, she was a labor trafficking victim who couldn't get out of this situation and was forced into this by this coercive adult. She ultimately had charges dropped, but this was one of those cases that sort of came to our attention. The second illicit economy case that I'll give you is another one, again, where sex trafficking was the primary way that the young person was identified, which again was making us think we are probably scratching the surface of these illicit economy cases, street economy cases. So in this case, the young woman was identified because she was in a sexual relationship with a member of a gang. And so people thought she was a sex trafficking victim. And so she was sent to a sex trafficking program where she was screened. And she had a few meetings with the providers who she was really, there was not a lot of disclosure. She was very unwilling to provide a lot of information. But she'd had a long history of past involvement with the child welfare system and the juvenile justice system. But during the meeting with the caseworker who was screening her for all of this potential sex trafficking victimization, she discloses that she's in fact has a backpack that's filled with firearms because her job for the gang was to take firearms from one location to another in these backpacks. And no one suspected her of that criminal activity. And she was really scared because she was basically being coerced by someone she was having a sexual relationship in the gang to engage in this firearm trafficking, right? So moving these firearms from place to place and giving firearms to people at different places. So they found she had a bag entirely filled with firearms. They were loaded firearms, right? This was not what they expected. She was not a sex trafficking victim, but she was engaged in this illegal activity related to this gang, in part for safety, security, because she was in this relationship with this person. She ultimately didn't go to law enforcement, didn't get services, and sort of went back into the wind, probably, you know, continuing in this sort of illicit economy situation. So this is a complicated phenomena, right, where we're talking about all different kinds of victims with different kinds of vulnerabilities that both are working in licit and illicit economies. And there's huge identification challenges. It's very difficult when people encounter these young people, they don't look like traditional victims. They don't look like the stereotype of the victim that they would be thinking about for human trafficking. We found a very small percentage, only about 15% of the cases were ever identified by law enforcement. So law enforcement had a role in some of these cases, but in many cases it was very peripheral. There was a lot of distrust of systems among both foreign national and US citizen victims. And most of the victims got themselves out of their own situation of exploitation on their own. They had a tremendous amount of resiliency where they got out of the situation, got to a place where they could be more stable, and then only became recognized as victims because they sought remedies from this legal provider. They sought status remedies, they were owed back wages, they had criminal charges that they needed help with. So again, the cases that we're able to identify are likely some of the most resilient victims who were stable enough to actually go seek out services, who'd found a trusting service provider that they could go work with, who had the cultural capacity, language skills, technical expertise to identify that what had happened to them was labor trafficking. So again, that iceberg probably keeps getting smaller and smaller for what we're actually tackling. But I think the study's been really helpful in helping us dispel a lot of myths about labor trafficking of children, to think more broadly about the phenomena. And we came away with a lot of different, I'm going to skip a couple of slides. So this is one of the things that I think is one of the most important findings, was that coercion was present in every single one of these cases, and that coercion looks really different for kids than it does for adults. right? And so it really made us rethink this standard of coercion. And one of the recommendations that we made as a result of this study is specifically about how to rethink that force, fraud, and coercion standard when it comes to kids. Because an older person having a relationship with a young person was pretty much always inherently coercive. So in terms of the recommendations, and then I'm going to stop and take questions, there were a lot of different recommendations we made, and the first batch were legal recommendations. I'm not going to walk through all of them, but I am going to say that one area that I think is an unmet need is really ensuring that child labor trafficking is recognized in situations where there's labor exploitation occurring. And so one of the recommendations we're making is that if you have a situation where the Fair Labor Standard Act is violated for a child worker, that there is an assumption of coercion, right? That proving coercion is assumed, right, for minors. This would be a way to make the law kind of more comparable to that sex trafficking law, where you have automatically, you don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. But in this situation, what we're saying is, if you have children working in violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act, and there's evidence of violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act, we should assume coercion, right? And we should be able to charge those employers with child labor trafficking, right? Again, that's assuming that the criminal justice system is somehow the solution to the problem. So most of our recommendations are actually about services for young people, because we think that that's actually where there are more protections. We have some in here around civil protections, allowing people to get back wages and civil protection that we think are really important. But this recommendation around prevention, I think, is where there's really more meat. And that's really about shoring up all of these places of protection. And for foreign national kids that particularly have been in that ORR custody, where those are the unidentified, unaccompanied minors, the lack of supervision of sponsors was criminal itself, right? There is so much shoring up that needs to be done there. So there's very little inspection or auditing that when a young person is sponsored out to someone, that they A, go to school, that they B, are safe, that they're not working too many hours. This is a simple solution. I mean, it's not simple in the sense that it takes a lot of money to do, but it's simple in the sense that we could do it. We know where those kids are supposed to be. We know who the sponsors are supposed to be, and we could do auditing and checks on them. We don't generally. There's very little accountability of people that are sponsored out. And so these kids go into the wind, right? And we don't know where they are. We have thousands of missing unaccompanied children that ORR has no idea where they are, and that ICE has no idea where they are, that are living precariously in the United States. So being able to think about a much stricter oversight and protection of child workers. One of the things I think is important to come away from this study is, and this is a piece that from Hannah Dryer's work, I felt like at the end of some of it, we didn't really get to this place because it was all about kind of like tamping down on working regulation, really strengthening working regulations for kids. The thing that was important, though, for so many of the people we interviewed and looked at their case records was that they needed to work. They owed people money. Their families owed people money. So they either needed some way to have that threat go away, and they needed to be protected, right? So if we could provide for their housing, we could provide for their care, we could provide for their food, that solves part of the problem, but it doesn't solve the problem of them owing money. And so finding ways that young people could work is still important. And it's important for other reasons, because working, I think we all would agree, is actually part of a healthy development for young people. Young people need to work in healthy, nurturing situations where they learn how to work, where they get experience, where they learn skills. Working isn't bad. We don't want to say kids can't work. We don't want to say foreign national kids can't work. We want to say work should be safe, right? And that when children are in situations where they're working, they're not being exploited, right? So I think it's very important not to come away with this with the idea that kids just shouldn't work and kids shouldn't have those opportunities. But we need to think about ways that becomes safe and non-harmful, and that people don't take advantage of young people who are disposable and then just take advantage of the next young person that comes in, which is what we see. We see these young people getting exploited, being in precarious situations, getting out of that situation, and just another young person coming in to fill that spot of being exploited. So that is a real hard look at our industries, what we pay for things, our willingness to actually support fair work and healthy work for kids. And those are much bigger problems than the criminal justice system is set up to solve, right? So there are accountability measures that are important in this, but they are not going to solve the problem of child labor trafficking. And there are many other domains that are really critical for us to look at if we want to address this problem. So I'll stop there and take questions. Yeah.
Why do you think that only, is it 11 states that have classified, is it exploitative labor as child abuse? Why haven't more states?
That's a great question. I mean, it really, so one, the federal government didn't mandate them to. They only classified, I mean, it actually was pretty amazing. We got to 2014, 2015, and most states had not integrated sex trafficking even into their child abuse standards. So most of the kids we identified for sex trafficking violation, victimization, were being brought in under a different type of child welfare allegation, like sexual assault. Right, they were being seen as victims of their child abuse allegation was sexual assault, but they were really a child sex trafficking victim. So the federal government forced states to do this on sex trafficking, but not on labor trafficking. And I really think it comes down to the problem of the fact that in many states, child workers are important. That they're utilized for agriculture, they're utilized broadly. There are many states that have industries that depend on child labor, and there's a real fear that if you made child labor that's exploitive a form of child abuse, that would have economic impacts on the state. I think people are very afraid of that.
One other question. You said that 15% of law enforcement identify child...
No, I'm saying of the cases that we looked at, only 15% were identified by law enforcement. So the majority of those 70 cases that we coded had no law enforcement involvement. Law enforcement had never been involved or identified them.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for coming to talk to us here at Sam Houston.
Absolutely.
So my question is, after completing your study, do you have any opinions, personal or otherwise, about the effectiveness of, like, for example, airports having posters on the bathroom doors saying, please contact if you are a victim of labor trafficking or any forms of trafficking?
I mean, I think generally those things raise awareness of the issue. I worry sometimes that they raise awareness in the wrong direction, right? That they reinforce stereotypes. But I do think just generally recognition that individuals could be in exploitive situations is probably a good thing. I mean, trafficking is one of those weird areas that like gets co-opted by QAnon, gets like, I mean, it's a wacky space, I have to say, right? Because so human trafficking is what we in political science call a valence issue, right? So no one thinks trafficking is good, right? Everyone is opposed to trafficking. So if you can include in your bill or that it's doing something about trafficking, like everybody supports it, right? It's one of those things that they're sort of universal. Now, once we get into the weeds and sort of see who trafficking victims are and what their needs are and the structural change, then, that maybe we're not so supportive. But this general moral notion, I think, is widely accepted, right? And so there's all kinds of problematic things that emerge when we have those widely held notions. And sometimes people who are nefarious themselves tack on that they're combating child trafficking. And we've actually seen situations that have emerged where people in the anti-trafficking movement are trafficking people who are victims in their movement, right? So it's a complicated space. And so I think that question of what our advertising is, I do think more questions about how we as a public understand the problem is super important.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for good talk. I learned a lot. So I have two questions, but you can answer only one question.
Okay.
Here.
Do I get to choose?
I think the example you provide is females. So I'm wondering, is there any, in terms of their experience, gender difference, males and females? The other question is actually, here, a lot of the emphasis is on identification or law enforcement, but more my concern is after the scene. After they are identified, especially those, a lot of them are isolated from families and then even their countries. So do you have enough confidence on U.S. government to take care of their trauma, or after that, what age they usually experience?
Yeah, and I didn't have as much chance to talk about it today, but one whole chapter of this report is specifically on, right, identification is just the beginning of an incredibly long journey for survivors. And I would have to say that our interviews with adult survivors of child labor trafficking, who are oftentimes many years out of that experience, were heartbreaking because they just showed how much people continued to struggle as adults, right? That they continued to struggle through the trauma that happened to them. They continued to struggle with the fact that when they got out of the labor trafficking situation, they were in an equally marginalized, vulnerable economic position as they were when they went in, sometimes even more. And so there's a lot of protections that need to be put in place to ensure they don't get re-trafficked. And that is actually something that we see over and over again, both in sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And it's one of those things that makes people feel like maybe this person wasn't a real victim, or maybe we shouldn't have spent our time and resources on them, or maybe this wasn't, this is their fault, not the situation's fault, which is we do see people return to exploitive situations. Sometimes because they have, again, don't have good options. Someone offers them a place you get out of a trafficking situation, you get back on your feet, you're now trying to work again. It's probably pretty easy for you to land up in another exploitive situation if nothing else has changed about the environment that you were in originally that got you in that exploitive situation. So it's really important. That back end part, identification does not solve the problem. This is not a rescue narrative where we're like, we just need to go in and rescue them and then they'll be all better, right? This is about structural change, right? There are things we could do on an individual level to help provide resilience and remedy some of the vulnerabilities for individual victims. It is really about resources, support, housing, job opportunities, right? Real tangible things to help them navigate a system that's set up for their own exploitation. But I think on the prevention end, this is about taking a hard look at the way we do work in this country, right? And how we have employment and what it means to have a minimum standard of living and who we have doing what jobs and what we pay them and what we're perfectly fine paying people and where we look the other way when we have whole industries that need to use exploitable labor in some type in order to be profitable, right? And that is a hard question, right? That isn't that individual victim, but that's what has to happen if we're going to actually combat this phenomena. Yeah.
One of the TVPA reauthorizations prevents us from deportation of unaccompanied minors because of the risk of them being trafficked in that scenario. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's a hope that perhaps reunification with the families will prevent them from returning, yet we have an ORR in place that is not doing any auditing or monitoring of them as they're being sent off to sponsors. Yep. Is the risk higher in that situation to be trafficked? And what is the solution in your opinion?
It's this is the crux of the problem, right? The intent of that law was a good one, right? The intent of that law was very positive. But yes, I think in some situations, they're almost, so I'm working on a paper right now where we're actually looking at where those kids go and like if you land in a county that has high levels of wage and hour violation or OSHA violations so what it means is that then if you're a young person being sent to a place where most of the job opportunities in that area are exploitive, right, you're likely to be exploited. So right now it's a completely broken system where there is a lot of chance for those young people to be exploited. And again, it takes resources and it takes commitment and it's going to take money, but we could audit. That is doable. It's not like we don't know where those people are when they first get sponsored out, but we don't audit them. And then we are mysteriously surprised when those young people disappear, can't be found, end up exploited. So I think it's an equally, if not worse, situation. We knew where everybody was. So you can, right? It takes resources. It's not, that's what I'm saying. It's not like one of those structural problems that can't be solved. It's actually a fairly easy solution, but it just takes resources and takes commitment. And at the same time, we've seen this huge decrease in the number of staff at DOL, right? So like, why are we surprised that this is happening? If we have decreasing resources and staff for Department of Labor, and you have some states gutting their Department of Labor, right, which is the only place any of these workplaces that, again, are in the regulated workplace space are going to be inspected, how are we surprised that there is more exploitation? Yeah.
Are there any countries doing this better than us? I'm assuming there's child exploitation of labor in many other countries.
I mean, there are many countries doing it much worse than us, and that's in part what lets us say it's not so bad here, right? And I do think that that is what supports this mentality of like, well, it's better here than it was where somebody else could have been, right? There are truly horrific situations of child labor in other countries, absolutely, right? There aren't a lot of great models. But not surprisingly, countries that do have immigration but have more social services around immigration do better, right? Have less exploitation. It's not an uncontroversial issue, even in countries in, say, Northern Europe, where you do have a much broader and stronger social support network. Issues of migration, and I mean, we can get real deep into the weeds. I mean, I think there are significant issues around what global trade policies have done to the economies of the global South, and then we're somehow surprised that people come to the global North for safety, security, and basic resources being met. But I do think it comes back to what are we as a country in the United States? What are our values? And one of our core values is liberty. And so the question becomes, how do we do that? Right? And how do we do that in a country where that is one of our core values? And that is not necessarily the core values of every country around the world, but it is our core value. Again, these are big questions. That's why the solution isn't like we pass a law and yay, we've solved child labor trafficking, right? These are big structural problems. Everybody put their hand down. Did you not think your question was good enough?
No pressure.
Okay, do two, okay.
Did the adult survivors of trafficking have any suggestions on how to incentivize like seeking resources or stakeholders, especially with that huge fear of DCF being notified? So there were. I mean, basically they said they would have sought help much sooner if they didn't fear. So DCF is like, they kind of got away unscathed in this presentation, but there's a lot in this report about, another big problem, a big system problem, is that this solution so we say don't criminalize kids, don't put them in prison, we'll send them to the child welfare system. But that is not a solution for, most kids. The child welfare system is seen by young people, in many cases, is equally as harmful as the juvenile justice system. The only difference is that you don't have a record that carries with you, potentially, right? And so we have big problems with the child welfare system in that young people are not getting the needs for their own, protection met in child welfare organizations, right? So that there is, again, a big issue around child welfare. And that was one of their main solutions. Like, if I would have had a place to go, I wanted to get help. I didn't want to do all this on my own, but I'd heard all of these terrible things about child welfare, or I'd been in child welfare before and I didn't want to go back there. So I stayed in a trafficking situation as opposed to going into child welfare, right? And that's a sad state when someone stays in a victimization situation that they know is victimizing, because the solution that we have for them isn't, in their opinion, better.
Hey there, thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I guess kind of keeping on this narrative, maybe moving this away from, criminalization aspect or even bogging down the immigration system more than it is. How do we better incentivize businesses who are inherently a part of this exploitation process, whether it's through, using contract labor, so they're not technically our
Yeah.
employees or something else. How do we
Hotels,
incentivize
right, yeah.
them not to engage with this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, generally, we haven't had incentives, right? We've had sticks, not carrots, right? So we've tried to punish them for their engagement. And then I think there's a place for accountability there, right? So there's, and that contract labor piece is a massive part of this, right? That is these workplace staffing, contract labor, that is an area that, again, provides, and it's one of those things that is, sorry, my answer to this is a little disjointed because I had like 7 thoughts at once. I mean, if you think about this in like a virus, right? If that virus killed everybody every time, that virus would die off. These contract labor and staffing agencies don't always put people in exploitive work situations, right? Sometimes, because if they did, no one would ever agree to go to that recruiting firm, right? And so it becomes hard for the end user to navigate when someone's going to be dangerous or not. So I think the incentivizing people to hire individuals who are, in situations where we created, one way to do this would be create pathways to work that didn't require you to hire undocumented workers, right? That required you to hire workers that had been vetted through a system where regulations would be followed for that worker. Would be certainly one way to incentivize that, is if we had a way that could work. And then I do think there's this question about, like, could you make consumers, right? Could we advertise fair labor? I'm really torn on that one because I think that there's a value to that, and I think as a society, we're going to have to want that enough to create the policies around it, but I don't know that we do it in our consumption, because we don't right now have the information to do it in our consumption, right? And in places where we do have that information, we don't use it well. I mean, nutritional label information is one example of that, right? We still all eat our trans fats, even though we know we shouldn't, right? So having that information doesn't always seem to change consumption. It could be a pathway of exposure right now we're exposing bad labor practices, but maybe we could expose good labor practices in a way that the community could celebrate. That might be, and we've done some of, I think that there are not a lot of good ones, but there's some examples of that in returning citizens. So people leaving situations of incarceration, and maybe this is because I'm from Massachusetts where we do a little bit of this, but we do have situations where the city has given out awards, for example, in Boston, to workplaces that have hired returning citizens and create really fair and non-exploitive labor pathways for them, right? So recognition of that. And it's really encouraged some businesses to do that more.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.